Everybody thinks the women brought Solomon down. The problem is that by the time they appear in the story, the fall had already been happening for years. Because when most people tell Solomon's story, they start at the ending. The idols, the compromises, the disaster. The kingdom slowly drifting away from everything it once stood for. But that's like watching the last 5 minutes of a movie and assuming that's where the plot begins. It doesn't. The real problem started much earlier. Back when everything looked perfect, the kingdom was at its peak. The wealth was at its peak, the fame was at its peak. No major enemies, no immediate threats, no crisis demanding attention. Everything was working. And for a king, that's usually when the dangerous thoughts start showing up. Not the dramatic ones, the quiet ones, the comfortable ones. Because success creates a strange problem. It's when someone spends so much time getting things right that they start believing certain rules no longer apply to them. It's like reaching the top of a mountain and deciding gravity is probably a problem for people lower down. At first, Solomon had been different. When he became king, he openly admitted he needed wisdom. He knew he didn't have all the answers. He knew the job was bigger than he was. That attitude became one of his greatest strengths. But success has a habit of editing old memories. After a while, people stop remembering how much help they needed. They start remembering how smart they were. And Solomon had accumulated something very dangerous. A nearly uninterrupted record of success. Build something, worked. Expand something, worked. Make a decision, worked. Judge a difficult case, worked. At this point, failure was becoming a theoretical concept. The kingdom kept growing, the wealth kept growing, the praise kept growing. And every success quietly delivered the same message. You know what you're doing. Then the message evolved. You really know what you're doing. Then it evolved again. You probably know better than everyone else. Recent track record, brilliant. Need for correction, apparently cancelled. And this is where the story takes a turn most people miss, because the women didn't create the problem. They found a problem that was already there. The real danger had started years earlier. Not when Solomon stopped being wise. When he started trusting his wisdom a little too much. The kingdom still looked strong. The palace still looked magnificent. The economy still looked unstoppable. Everything visible suggested stability. But underneath the success, something small had begun to crack. The kind of crack nobody notices when the building still looks perfect. The kind of crack people explain away because everything seems fine. The kind of crack that keeps growing while everyone is busy admiring the building. And this is where the story stops being about women. Because the first crack wasn't emotional, it wasn't political, it wasn't romantic, it was internal. A man who had spent so long being right, that the possibility of being wrong was slowly disappearing from the conversation. And that's what made the situation dangerous. Not because Solomon lacked wisdom, because he had so much of it that he was beginning to trust himself more than the principles that had given him that wisdom in the first place. Because the first crack wasn't emotional. It was something far more dangerous. The most dangerous moment in Solomon's life wasn't when he became confused. It was when he stopped believing he could be. And that is a surprisingly dangerous place to arrive. Because confusion asks questions. Certainty usually doesn't. By this point, Solomon had been successful for decades. Not weeks, not months, decades. The kingdom was thriving. The economy was thriving. The alliances were working. The projects were succeeding. Everything seemed to confirm the same conclusion. Solomon knew what he was doing, and to be fair, he usually did. That's what made the situation so dangerous. Because failure often gets a person's attention. Success usually gets their trust. And Solomon had accumulated an enormous amount of trust in himself. Decision after decision had worked. Year after year had worked. Plan after plan had worked. The evidence kept piling up. And eventually success starts creating a very specific kind of blindness. Not blindness to reality, blindness to the possibility of being wrong. It's when someone spends so much time being the smartest person in the room that they stop asking questions when they enter one. Not because they're arrogant. At least not intentionally. They simply stop expecting correction. After all, correction is usually something people receive after mistakes. And Solomon wasn't seeing many mistakes. At least none that seemed important. Advice remained available. The perceived need for it was disappearing. Wise counselors still existed. Trusted advisors still existed. Experienced voices still existed. The problem was that none of them had Solomon's record, and little by little, something began changing. Not his intelligence, not his wisdom, his relationship with them. Because wisdom and humility are supposed to grow together. When one continues growing and the other stops, the balance starts breaking. At first, nobody notices, including the person involved. There is no dramatic moment, no sudden transformation, no scene where Solomon wakes up and announces, "Today I will begin making terrible decisions." That would actually be helpful. Instead, the process is much quieter, much slower, much more believable. The king still looks wise. The kingdom still looks healthy. The future still looks bright. Everything appears normal, which is exactly why the danger is so difficult to recognize, because some people stop listening to others. Others stop listening to themselves. The hesitation, the warning signs, the uncomfortable questions, the small moments of doubt that exist for a reason, those become easier to dismiss when success keeps backing up every decision. And eventually something new starts appearing. Small exceptions. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just little adjustments, little allowances, little reasons why a rule might not apply this time, or that time, or the next time. Modern life sees this constantly. Someone follows a principle for years. The principle protects them. The principle works. Then one day they decide they understand the principle so well that they no longer need to follow it quite as carefully. It's like spending years learning why guardrails exist, and then deciding they are mostly decorative. The problem wasn't that Solomon lacked wisdom. The problem was that he trusted it too much. More specifically, he trusted himself too much. And that is where the crack from the previous chapter begins widening, because the next stage of the story doesn't start with rebellion. It starts with exceptions, one small exception, then another, then another. And almost nobody notices the danger when it begins, because almost nobody gets lost on the first step. And that's where the next stage begins, not with a rebellion, not with a scandal, not with a dramatic moment where Solomon suddenly abandons everything he believes. It begins with exceptions, small ones, reasonable ones, the kind nobody worries about. Because Solomon didn't abandon his principles, he started negotiating small parts of them, and that's a very different thing. At least at first, the kingdom was still thriving. The treasury was still overflowing, the building projects were still expanding, the international alliances were still growing. Nothing looked broken, nothing looked dangerous, nothing looked like the beginning of a collapse, which made every exception easier to justify. Because consequences have an annoying habit. They usually arrive late, very late, and during that delay, bad decisions can look surprisingly intelligent. One concession, then another, then another. Nothing seems large enough to cause concern. Nothing seems serious enough to trigger alarm. Nothing seems dangerous enough to stop. And that's exactly why the process becomes dangerous. Because major failures rarely begin with major failures. They begin with small permissions, tiny compromises, little adjustments. The principle stays. The application changes. The standard stays. The interpretation becomes flexible. It's when the rule still exists. But someone starts believing it was written mostly for other people. The rule remains. The exception simply becomes more important. Then another exception appears. Then another. Then another. Before long, the exceptions are doing most of the work. Original code, maintained. Current implementation, creative. And that's where Solomon found himself. The man known throughout the world for wisdom was beginning to do something remarkably common. He was becoming very skilled at explaining why certain limits didn't need to apply quite the same way anymore. Not because he stopped believing they were wise, because he believed he understood them well enough to adjust them. And that's where the real danger appears. Because the problem wasn't moving away from wisdom. The problem was believing wisdom gave him permission to move closer to the edge. The irony is difficult to ignore. The wisest man on earth starts creating arguments not to follow what he already knows. Not because he lacks information, not because he lacks understanding, not because nobody warned him, because information was never the problem. The problem was justification. And justification becomes incredibly persuasive when it supports something a person already wants. A warning becomes a suggestion. A boundary becomes a guideline. A principle becomes a recommendation. And every step feels reasonable. Every step feels manageable. Every step feels harmless, which is exactly what makes it dangerous, because people rarely think they're drifting, they think they're adapting, they think they're being practical, they think they're making sensible adjustments. Meanwhile, the direction keeps changing, quietly, gradually, one step at a time. The fall didn't begin when Solomon changed direction. It began when he started justifying the detour. And that's the part almost nobody notices while it's happening, because almost nobody gets lost on the first step. And then wisdom starts doing something nobody expects. And then wisdom starts doing something nobody expects. It changes sides, not completely, not all at once, but enough to become dangerous. Because Solomon's problem wasn't a lack of answers. If anything, he had too many of them. That was the problem. He could explain almost anything, defend almost anything, justify almost anything, and eventually that creates a situation more dangerous than ignorance. A person who can successfully argue against their own conscience. At this point, Solomon wasn't stumbling through confusion. He wasn't making reckless decisions without thinking. Quite the opposite. He was thinking about them a lot, and the more he thought about them, the easier they became to defend. Because intelligence has a strange ability. It can solve problems, but it can also explain them away, especially when the explanation benefits the person creating it. The limits became flexible, the warnings became negotiable, the boundaries became increasingly open to interpretation, and every explanation sounded reasonable, which made them even more dangerous. It's when someone becomes so intelligent that they can win every argument against themselves. Conscience, raising concerns. Internal lawyer, winning unanimously. And that's where Solomon found himself. The same mind that had once helped him recognize wisdom was now helping him avoid it. The same intelligence that had solved difficult problems was now protecting difficult mistakes. And that's the uncomfortable part of the story, because wisdom didn't disappear. It simply started working for the wrong side. The kingdom still looked successful. The wealth still existed. The influence still remained. From the outside, many people would have struggled to see the problem, which is often how these situations work. The consequences usually arrive long after the decisions that created them, and eventually they arrived. Not because Solomon lacked warning, not because nobody knew better, not because the outcome was unpredictable. The consequences were familiar, the consequences were known, the consequences had always been there. They were simply easier to ignore while everything appeared to be working. And that's what makes this chapter of Solomon's life so uncomfortable. Because the problem isn't difficult to understand, most people have done some version of it. Not on the scale of a kingdom, but in smaller ways. The decision they already knew wasn't wise. The compromise they already understood. The exception they already justified. The warning they quietly explained away. And the explanation always sounds convincing at the time. That's why it works, that's why people believe it, and that's why it becomes dangerous. The irony couldn't be clearer. The man famous for wisdom wasn't defeated by ignorance. He was defeated by his ability to explain things. The intelligence remained, the knowledge remained, the experience remained. What changed was the direction. And once wisdom begins protecting mistakes instead of correcting them, the consequences are usually just a matter of time, because intelligence does not prevent self-deception. Sometimes it perfects it. And then come consequences Solomon had known about for years. And then come consequences Solomon had known about for years. Which brings the story to the part most people miss, because Solomon's story is often told as a warning about failure. But that's not really what makes it remarkable. What makes it remarkable is who failed. Solomon wasn't uninformed. He wasn't inexperienced. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't lacking wisdom. If anything, he had more wisdom than anyone around him. And that's exactly the point, because Solomon doesn't prove that wisdom fails. He proves something much more uncomfortable. Wisdom is not immunity. Looking back, the pattern becomes surprisingly clear. Success, confidence, exceptions, justifications, detours, consequences. The sequence isn't complicated. In fact, that's what makes it so dangerous. Most people imagine major failures happening because someone didn't know better. But history is full of people who knew exactly what they were doing, people who could explain the risks, describe the dangers, predict the outcome, and still walk directly toward it. Knowledge maximum, ability to rationalize also maximum, and that's the lesson sitting underneath Solomon's story. The problem was never knowing the right path. The problem was believing that knowing the path removed the possibility of leaving it. Because those are two completely different things. A map is not a guarantee, a warning is not protection, knowledge is not immunity, and wisdom is not armor, not by itself. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Most people remember Solomon as the wisest man who ever lived. But the reason his story survives isn't because wisdom made him untouchable, it's because it didn't. His story exists because wisdom alone was never enough. The man who understood consequences still faced them. The man who understood limits still crossed them. The man who recognized truth still found ways to justify ignoring it. And that's what makes the story feel surprisingly modern, because very few people destroy their lives through ignorance. Much more often, they talk themselves into things they already know aren't wise. One exception, one justification, one detour. Then another, until the distance becomes impossible to ignore. And that's why Solomon's story continues to resonate, not because most people see themselves as kings, but because most people recognize the pattern, the compromise that seemed harmless, the explanation that sounded reasonable, the confidence that felt earned, the warning that became easy to dismiss, and the uncomfortable realization that intelligence and wisdom don't eliminate human nature. They simply give it better vocabulary. In the end, Solomon's story isn't about a lack of wisdom. It's about what happens when a person begins trusting themselves more than the principles that made them wise in the first place. Because Solomon didn't fall because he lacked wisdom. He fell because his wisdom slowly convinced him that he wouldn't.